1920s addressing the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League said so many things applicable to the conditions of today. To read the world's history of races written by some writers gives the impression that the black man amounted to nothing in the creation. We are satisfied, however, to know that our race gave the first great civilization to the world. For centuries, our ancestral home was the seat of learning, and here black men who were faithful to gods were philosophers, scientists, artists, and men of vision and leadership. On the other hand, our traducers were groping in darkness and continental barbarism. Black men, you are once great, and you will be great again. Great men have come out of Egypt, out of Ethiopia, out of Africa, Sahara. Great men will come out of America, the West Indies, and the islands of the sea. Our history is as great as that of any race or people, and nothing on this side of heaven or hell will make us deny it, notwithstanding the false treaties, essays, speculation, and philosophies. Their arrogance is but skin deep, and an assumption that has no foundation in morals nor law. When we were embracing the sciences on the banks of the Nile, when our civilization had reached the noonday of progress, their ancestors were still running naked and sleeping in holes with bats, rats, and other animals. Garvey's messianic message to the groping millions of his race would surely bring him to Golgotha. His leadership would emancipate millions from the shackles of mental and moral servitude. It was the great gulf, it was the violent contrast between the upper and middle classes and the people of his race, which made the first telling impact on the mind of the youthful Garvey. Illiteracy and grinding poverty were the two decisive factors which contributed to his impact. Like Socrates, Garvey geared himself for his cup of hemlock, like a Christ on his way to a blood-stained cross. Before his death, however, in 1940, he would have the satisfaction of knowing that a squalid century after the emancipation of 1838, the men and systems against whom he fought such a good fight had lost forever their footing on the ladder of imperial and economic power. Marcus Garvey left you a special message, my children. Let no voice but your own speak to you from the depths. Let no voice but your own rouse you in time of peace or war. Hear all, but attend only to that which concerns you. Your allegiance shall be to your God, then to your family, race, and country. Remember always that the Jew, in his political and economic urge, is always first a Jew. The Caucasian is first a Caucasian under all circumstances, and you can do no better than to be first and always a black man. Be sure to teach your children science and religion, for it lies as our only hope to withstand the evil designs of modern materialism. Lift up your hearts and repeat to yourselves the words of the African poet Terence. I am a man, and I think that nothing that is common to humanity is foreign to me. Garvey endeared himself to his thousands of listeners when he dramatized and immortalized the heroes and heroines of Afro-American history. Through the power of his oratory, Garvey showed them that Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman were equally deserving of a niche in the Hall of Fame as Martha Washington and Betsy Ross. They were made to feel that the muse which inspired Phyllis Wheatley was no less fine. Or Lawrence Dunbar was made to take his place with the great poets of the world. It was seen that the African general Hannibal surpassed Napoleon in military genius, and Toussaint Louverture and Antonio Maceo were worthy of comparison with George Washington and Lord Kitchener. Marcus Garvey's spellbound audiences heard that Crispus Attucks was as great as Patrick Henry, and that the Ethiopian Queen of Sheba outshined Britain's Queen Victoria, in the splendor of her court. Solomon, in his wisdom, towered above Gladstone. King Menelik was more than Abe Lincoln. Never before had the descendants of the slaves been so afflicted. Marcus Garvey delivered that message, and all the world wondered. Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad. It was the same message delivered 4,000 years before by the Jewish patriot. Let my people go. Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of his journey, we pause to assess his work and worth. We find that Marcus Garvey has left his people in America at the crossroads of history and destiny. The now 38 independent states in Africa are the first of the fruits of them that slept in the chronology of his prophecy. To quote his own words, "Hail, United States of Africa, hail." Also Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Guyana, and his own homeland, Jamaica, still on the wave of freedom. The associated states within the British Commonwealth of Nations, Grenada, Antigua and Barbuda, Montserrat, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Dominica, Anguilla, and the British Virgin Islands, flying the flag of freedom and independence and echoing the voice of Marcus Garvey. Whatever his failings, Marcus Garvey brought fresh hope and courage to his people. Mankind has benefited because Marcus Garvey passed here. And who knows, but someday posterity will confirm him in the title of the Black Moses. Then millions of black men, women, and children will make the pilgrimage to his shrine in Jamaica, for they will have come to pray and kneel at the tomb of the father of African independence. Oh, he vowed to win his race's destiny, to lift them up from ignorance and hell. With deathless courage, fashioned victory, fighting on equal fares,
Okay. First, I'm going to get my thank yous out because I don't want to forget to say thank you to anyone. So definitely thank you to the UNIA for extending this invitation. Also to Liberty Hall and to its new director, Anya Thompson, who's been very helpful during this process. And I also thought I saw Miss Natola on here too, who was helping me out with some research. So definitely thank you to Liberty Hall for that. Also my home institution, Howard University, the Fulbright program, and my Jamaica home institution, the University of West Indies, where I am currently affiliated with the Department of History and Archaeology. I also want to thank Dr. Nydia Swaby, who you're going to hear from later on in the program. Not only is she one of the scholars who's adding to the knowledge and preservation on Amy Ashwood Garvey's legacy, she has been so helpful to me during my dissertation process, much of which happened under the COVID pandemic. And so, you know, everything was closed, and she shared so many resources with me, as well as introduced me to at least one other individual who shared resources with me so that I could write my dissertation and speak a bit more knowledgeably about Amy Ashwood Garvey. So I would not be speaking to you today, possibly, if not for her assistance, because the world was shut down for a little while. My research specifically focuses on Afro-Jamaican Garveyites who repatriated to Liberia between 1920 and 1964. And I also focus on what was happening here in Jamaica with Garveyites, as well as with other activists in the community, and what sort of work they were doing. And so Amy Ashwood Garvey certainly figures into that. And I'm going to try to be a little brief, but a little detailed. You know, it's hard for historians to pare down, but I'm going to try to pare down, and please just let me know if I'm speeding along too quickly. So there is so much to be said about Amy Ashwood Garvey and her African diasporic legacy on her 125th birthday. So where to begin? Today, I want to say a bit about why Amy Ashwood Garvey is still understudied and some of her political contributions. In his biographic essay on Amy Ashwood Garvey, Dr. Roan Frazier suggested that Lionel M. Yard, Amy Ashwood Garvey's first biographer, occupied himself more with her emotional history in his book, while Toni Martin, her second biographer, wrote about the political history of Amy Ashwood Garvey. And I would offer that we should consider Amy Ashwood Garvey's emotional and political history and allow both to inform how we examine and speak about Ashwood Garvey and her life's work. To examine her emotional and political history begins to provide the layers necessary to study this complicated individual that was Amy Ashwood Garvey. We have Ashwood Garvey to thank for her first biography written by Lionel Yard. And that is, if we look at that in the context of Black Pan-African liberation struggles, women have frequently had to create the spaces, take on those leadership roles while not being acknowledged for their contributions, and frequently write themselves and other women back into our histories. Ashwood Garvey handpicked Afro-Bayesian chemist and emerging historian Lionel M. Yard as her biographer in the last months of her life and pushed him to complete that project, as well as seek a publisher for her manuscript on Marcus Garvey. While the most well-known biography on Ashwood Garvey is Toni Martin's work, which is extremely well researched, it is biased and negates Ashwood Garvey's activism, her entrepreneurism, and contributions as co-founder of the UNIA. Ashwood Garvey is to be credited for ensuring that the UNIA Constitution required that each new branch have not only a president, but a female co-president. Ashwood Garvey's life experiences informed her activism, which she expressed through forming political organizations, participation in coalitions, public lectures, writings, and international travel. And while she was extremely influenced by Garveyism and developed an organizing style from the UNIA, she would continue to develop her own organizing style, political ideology, and alliances long after her marriage to Garvey ended. Within Jamaica and outside of it, Ashwood Garvey articulated demands for social and political change, inclusive of women of the African diaspora. However, she's remained understudied in the historiography of the UNIA, as well as in studies of Pan-African liberation movements. And this lack of research on Ashwood Garvey can be connected to a few factors. The first would be Marcus Garvey, who Eula Y. Taylor notes strategically defamed and maligned her character to all who had an interest. Once Garvey and Amy Ashwood Garvey were divorced, her name completely disappeared from the Negro World, the official newspaper of the UNIA. The same newspaper that Ashwood Garvey frequently negotiated a printing line of credit for and delivered door to door in New York with Marcus Garvey when it was first established. She has been limited to being the first wife of Marcus Garvey and discredited as a co-founder of the UNIA by historians like Garvey scholar Tony Martin. Martin wrote extensively on Marcus Garvey, his philosophy, the UNIA, and also wrote the second biography on Amy Ashwood Garvey entitled Amy Ashwood Garvey, Pan-Africanist, Feminist, and Mrs. Marcus Garvey #1, or A Tale of Two Amys. However, Eula Taylor argues that Ashwood Garvey was not only the co-founder of the UNIA, but integral in shaping the structure of divisions and embedding gender balance into the organization. Furthermore, Ashwood Garvey served in many roles in the early years of the organization, and once she joined Garvey in New York, she supported fundraising efforts and established the UNIA's Ladies Division, which would later become the Black Cross Nurses. Ashwood Garvey was young when she and Garvey initially separated. She, however, was also intelligent, educated, and had aspirations of her own. And she told Lionel Yard that she felt that her mission, she was convinced was to work in a more intimate fashion in order to help Afro-American women to find themselves and rise in life. Garvey's rumors about adultery and inappropriate behavior for a woman, let alone a wife, aligned with the social morals of the times that women were subjected to. And Honor Ford Smith offers that the rumors about Ashwood Garvey and the dissolution of their marriage became discussions within the organization regarding women's rights. Members raised questions about monogamy and the right of wives to have male friends they chose, fidelity in marriage, appropriate conduct for women in public. And those conversations may have informed how women in the UNIA personally negotiated the prescribed gender roles in their activist work, but no official UNIA policy was ever published. In the end, Amy Ashwood Garvey left the organization, and those rumors served to assist in devaluing her contributions to the UNIA as a co-founder and activist. A second factor in the understudy of Amy Ashwood Garvey, as well as other women activists in the UNIA, is that UNIA scholarship has not always had a global scope or encompassed women. However, studies focused on female leadership in the UNIA and international divisions have become an emerging field over the past 2 decades. And part of the reason for this gap stems from what Cedric J. Robinson notes as the historical eliding of Garvey as a factor in the understudy or the dismissal of the UNIA. Robinson shared that since most histories of the organization were written by its critics, distortions of the UNIA abound in the literature, and they are especially marked with regard to its founder and principal organizer, Marcus Garvey. So this distortion in the literature on the UNIA and the Pan-African Black liberation movements is also male-centric, and women are pushed to the margins of that literature as men are brought to the forefront and centered as leaders. A third factor that can be contributed to the lack of literature on Amy Ashwood Garvey is what could be viewed as a narrow concept of an intellectual. While Ashwood Garvey co-founded organizations, established businesses, participated in politics transnationally, and traveled extensively and conducted research in several West African countries, her writings were mostly unpublished. And this presents a challenge to study an intellectual without their writings, but it's not impossible. Some of her writings were rescued from being destroyed when her foreclosed home, that also served as the Afro Women's Center in London, was cleaned out, but others have been lost or discarded. Ashwood Garvey did produce a pamphlet, Liberia, Land of Promise, with an introduction written by suffragist Sylvia Pankhurst. Ashwood Garvey specifically discussed this work in a letter to Liberian President William V.S. Tubman, where she outlined her last wishes just before her death. She instructed Tubman, "My book, Liberia, Land of Promise, I dreamt it was in the archives. I now ask you to give it to my daughter Eva with full instructions for her to have it published." It is unknown what happened to this pamphlet or manuscript, but the preview written by Sylvia Pankhurst is in an Amy Ashwood Garvey memorabilia collection donated to the Alma Jordan Library at the University of West Indies' St. Augustine campus by Ashwood Garvey's friend, Thelma Rogers. Two other works, the Black Woman, in the Post-War World and Black Millions, a biography on Marcus Garvey, were never published. It is unclear if Ashwood Garvey changed the name of her biography on Marcus Garvey from Black Millions to The Power and the Glory, the story of Marcus Mosiah Garvey, as she typed a letter soliciting contributions for a book with the latter name. Ashwood Garvey closes that letter with, "I am now ready to publish the life and work of Marcus Garvey after having been able to make comparisons with the leadership of the men of Garvey's day and time. Please contribute as liberally as you can and help me publish this book." Additionally, it is unknown what happened to the interviews and the archival research she conducted while she toured West Africa from 1946 to 1949. Ashwood Garvey discussed in an interview about her return to Jamaica after a 20-year absence that she was working on a book about the social aspects of Africa. She does mention the name of this book on Africa, but it also was not published. For Ashwood Garvey, not being pushed to the margins of history may be why she was so adamant in the last months of her life that her biographer, Lionel M. Yard, ensure that her manuscript on Marcus Garvey was published. She also asked Yard to write her biography during those last months of her life. And in letters between Ashwood Garvey and Yard from January to March of 1969, the status of her unpublished Marcus Garvey manuscript, deteriorating health, and financial strains are prevalent concerns. On January 1st, 1969, she writes to Yard, "I am very anxious about the book, and I do not want to destroy Marcus's image. But the more I think of it, the more I realize I must somehow defend myself. for it will pass into history if I do not make special mention of his behavior. What do you say? Ashwood Garvey had dedicated her life to advocating for her people, and it was imperative to her to have some control over her life's narrative and contributions to Pan-African struggles. In 1922, Ashwood Garvey left her New York life when she and Marcus Garvey separated and she toured Europe. When she returned to Jamaica, she told a reporter she had gone to Europe to study conditions, social problems, and human nature as part of a social and educational program she was working on. During that time, she met with some Nigerian students in London, and they told her of their difficulties in finding accommodations in London and their social isolation. In an effort to support African students in finding decent housing, Ashwood Garvey helped co-found the Nigerian Progressive Union with Nigerian student Lapido Solanke. And this was the first Nigerian organization in London, and it would be a precursor to the West African Student Union, of which Lapido Solanke was also a co-founder. WASU would later become a major anti-colonial and African organization in London. Ashwood Garvey did begin to mentor those students, but she did not remain in London at that time. When she returned in 1929 and settled into anti-colonial politics and social business endeavors, she was accompanied by calypsonian and playwright Samuel Manning, and the two opened the Florence Mills Social Parlour, which was a nightclub and restaurant in London. Ashwood Garvey named the nightclub after the internationally known Black entertainment trailblazer Florence Mills. It is unknown if Ashwood Garvey perhaps met Mills in New York, as she had also co-produced musicals, or if she just admired Florence Mills and her talent and wanted to memorialize the performer who died at the young age of 30. Whatever the case may be for the naming of that facility, London became a second home for Ashwood Garvey, and the Florence Mills Social Parlour became a social and political meeting place for artists, activists, celebrities, and students of the African diaspora living in the area. C.L.R. James remembered the club as the birthplace of the International African Friends of Abyssinia, and that Ashwood Garvey had played a prominent part in the organization of IAFA affairs. And other members of the IAFA included George Padmore, future advisor to Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, and future Prime Minister of Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta. The invasion of Ethiopia by Italy galvanized organizations and solidarity with Ethiopia throughout the African diaspora. Ashwood Garvey spearheaded many of the IAFA's early activities and coordinated one of its most memorable public rallies in Trafalgar Square in August 1935. Ashwood Garvey would continue to be part of Pan-African circles and active in politics in London for over 2 decades. Numerous Afro-Caribbean and African figures visited and settled in London between the late 1920s and 40s, including Marcus Garvey, Una Marson, and Eric Williams. Williams would later become the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. Ashwood Garvey would also collaborate with Afro-Caribbean journalist and activist Claudia Jones in the late 1950s after she was deported from the United States. Amy Ashwood Garvey toured West Africa beginning in 1946 after Liberian President William V.S. Tubman extended an invitation to her, and she would remain in West Africa for over 3 years and returned to London in July of 1949. She then began a lecturing tour of the Caribbean in March of 1953, and that lasted into October of that year. And these were some of Ashwood Garvey's most active years, where she studied the conditions of women of the African diaspora. She conducted research in Liberia's archives, collected oral interviews in Sierra Leone, Ghana, and Liberia, and established several organizations. Ashwood Garvey also adopted two Liberian women as her daughters, Elizabeth Wilson Obiamiwe and Eva Morris. Wilson Obiamiwe was also the cousin of President William Tubman, and she traveled with Ashwood Garvey from Liberia to Ghana and wrote regularly to President Tubman about her experiences. While on this tour in West Africa, Ashwood Garvey sought to understand the social conditions for African women during this time. She visited women's cooperatives, schools, and made numerous speeches about the liberation of the African woman and her role in society. The West African Pilot reported on two of her speaking engagements in 1947 and 1948. And in an article entitled Mrs. Amy Ashwood Garvey Arrives in Lagos Colony Studying Education of Eve, Ashwood Garvey commented that the focus of her visit was the emergence of the African woman, the education of the African woman, and the improvement of the lot of the African woman in general. She added that Nigeria has won the respect of many influential personalities in the United States, but her clamor for freedom could never be successful as long as her women were kept behind. While in Nigeria, as in the other West African countries she visited, she connected with locals to have them write down some of the local practices about marriage, languages spoken, female societies, native laws. She planned to write a series, Mother Africa, and in an article discussing her tour of West Africa, the manuscript is mentioned. The reporter describes Mother Africa as Ashwood Garvey's forthcoming book that many African leaders have read and called a masterpiece. The work is further described as an honest attempt to give the world the true background not only of the African, but the African woman of whom the Western world knows so little. This manuscript may have been lost or thrown away, as neither of Ashwood Garvey's biographers mentioned seeing it. Also of significance in Ashwood Garvey's tour of West Africa would be her time in Liberia, because she applied to become a Liberian citizen. In a letter dated May 27, 1946, from Ashwood Garvey to President Tubman, she writes, "Because of the pride I now feel in becoming a Liberian citizen, and because I also know of the aims, aspirations, and hope of millions of denationalized Blacks who look with jealous pride to the only Black republic in Africa, I not only beseech or recommend, but I demand that this Cultural Relations Department be established to work as a separate department in conjunction with the Department of Information, and thereby bridging the seemingly interminable and mysterious gulf which exists between Liberia and other races." President Tubman supported Ashwood Garvey becoming a citizen and also agreed to her idea about writing the history of Liberia. He gave her access to the country's archives and dictated to her from official correspondence. The two seem to have had a brief romantic relationship, and Ashwood Garvey wrote to a friend that Tubman had proposed marriage. All of Tubman's letters to Ashwood Garvey are not available to offer his perspective. However he may have felt about Ashwood Garvey, he married for a third time in 1948 while she was still in West Africa. Ashwood Garvey and Tubman would remain friends until her death. When she embarked on her lecture tour of the Caribbean from March through October of 1953, it was Garveyites that came out to hear her and host her. There were still active chapters of the UNIA in the Caribbean at this time, and devout Garveyites that had known Ashwood Garvey. She toured Barbados, Aruba, Curacao, Trinidad, and Guyana. And while there, she established the Barbados Women's Alliance to support women in consolidating their efforts. In Trinidad, a Garvey committee sponsored her lecture at the Himalaya Club. Her lecture, Women as Leaders of World Thought, called upon Afro-Caribbean women to become more politically active in their countries. She stated, "I have come to find out that in several islands in the West Indies, women are not politically conscious. I share the affinity of your desire. Therefore, it is important to me. I am a part of you, and I am jealous of the position of the European woman. The fact that she is prepared to make the supreme sacrifice for her nation makes me jealous because I belong to a race of people whose women are not yet fully conscious of its latent talents and great powers." Ashwood Garvey continued to advocate for women's rights and participate in the growing race issue in Britain, frequently in collaboration with Claudia Jones. Ashwood Garvey continued to live and organize on her own terms and utilized the Garvey name as cultural and political currency. She would not be the first woman to continue to utilize the name of an influential ex-spouse. The name afforded her access to political spaces that might not have been open to her as a woman, but it was up to her to make something of the access. Whether Ashwood Garvey wanted to be connected to Marcus Garvey for the rest of her life or not, she was always associated with him. She did not separate herself from Garveyism completely either. She continued to study the unique conditions in the context of the environment and approach solutions through self-help and collaborative efforts. Through her travel, study of conditions of descendants of Africans throughout the diaspora, she also kept Garveyism alive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adisa. I would like to actually pose questions to the audience. If anyone wants to ask Adisa any questions regarding her presentation, I actually have one that I would love to kick off.
Okay.
No, it's more technical though.
Okay.
Your sources, I'm assuming you delved into different sources to pull this together. Can you share some of those with us, just for maybe any students or researchers that are on the call?
Yeah, so probably the one source that people might be a little less familiar with at this point would be the William V.S. Tubman papers, President William V.S. Tubman of Liberia. And through a grant, those have all been digitized and you can access them online through Indiana University. So I think I probably quoted from a couple of letters written from Amy Ashwood Garvey to President Tubman, and those would have been from that digitized collection of papers of President William V.S. Tubman. I have also cited Dr. Nydia Swaby, her master's thesis, also Dr. Tony Martin, Dr. Roan Frazier, Professor Rupert Lewis, Honor Ford Smith, Professor Honor Ford Smith, Dr. Cedric J. Robinson. Pretty much everybody's probably, I think also Professor Natanya Duncan, also Professor Eula Taylor. Pretty much, I think most of those sources, most people, if they're studying Garvey, the UNIA, Amy Jacks Garvey, or Amy Ashwood Garvey, probably seek out some of those sources already. I'm thinking probably the one that is maybe the least well-known right now are that those papers from William Tubman are all digitized, and it's enormous, and it was a huge undertaking, and it's probably extremely helpful, even if you're not especially if you're not a Garvey scholar, but you might be studying international affairs, you might be studying something germane to Liberia and its relationships with some other countries. They are invaluable because they have, it's breathtaking how much they have been able to digitize correspondence-wise, as well as, state documents from every branch of government. So it's well worth taking a look. And if you have an internet connection, you can access it. You don't need to be a student there. And
Okay.
that's really helpful.
Most definitely.
Mhm.
Very interesting presentation. I learned quite a bit, actually. Thank you so much. Does anyone else have any questions for Adisa? I hope. Go ahead.
Could I ask?
Please do.
Uh-huh. What is her name? Boyce Davies. Carol Boyce Davies has written on Claudia Jones. Since you mentioned that Amy Ashwood collaborated with Claudia Jones, I wonder if there's anything useful that you might have come across if you have consulted it.
I did read her work on Claudia Jones. I think it's also cited in my dissertation. There's also another woman, and I'm not going to think of her name at all right now, but she has written more. She also, not extensively, but she also covers Amy Ashwood Garvey and Claudia Jones, but she's focusing on a particular incident that happened in Britain at that time around race relations. So they were some of the primary activists who were working on these different community organizations and mobilizing activities. It was a young man who was killed by a racist mob, and I cannot remember the scholar's name, and her book is really amazing, and I feel terrible, but she also talks about Amy Ashwood Garvey and Claudia Jones and their efforts working with Afro-Caribbean populations in London at this time. I'm gonna try to see if I have her in this section, but I don't think I cited her in this section though.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I noted that you mentioned Professor Duncan. I think she may have joined us. So if you do need to meet her,
okay.
for you both to at least get in touch.
Okay. Oh, I'm good.
Hi, good afternoon. It's a
Good
pleasure.
afternoon. Sorry to put you on the spot, Professor Duncan, but I saw you pop in, and once you mentioned your name, I couldn't help it.
No, I appreciate that, and thank you so much.
No problem.
If it's okay, Adisa, if I might ask you, and I apologize for asking the question in this way. Amy Ashwood sort of traverses places. She's kind of in and out in ways that allow us to look at transnationalism and presence differently than in the case of Claudia Jones, because in Claudia Jones's case, she moves because she is on some level forced to move, whereas Amy Ashwood is choosing where she goes, where and when she enters, so to speak. Do you feel that in any way affects how, as you point out, we're finding her in the Tubman papers? Does that in any way affect how we then construct an archive or a record of her life? Is it a hindrance or a help? And how does that help us to better understand Black travel, Black internationalism, and the construction of Black feminisms, plural?
I think that in terms of the archiving and what you said about Amy Ashwood Garvey being able to travel to these places and choosing to, and in the case of Claudia Jones, she is forced out through immigration, and she is not able to have this freedom to travel and go here, there, and everywhere. What I will say about archives, Black women activists, and intellectuals is that we are everywhere, and I don't want to say that it's a hindrance. I want to say that it makes the work more difficult, but just as necessary that it take place, because you could find things almost anywhere on these individuals. And like I said in the beginning, there's another layer to this now, and that we're all trying to figure out how we live and do our research and still be humans under COVID. I couldn't access many of these things that I was able to write about because it was COVID and I was writing my dissertation and the libraries were closed and everybody hasn't digitized everything, and you couldn't come into certain archives. And there were scholars, like I said in the beginning, like Dr. Nydia Swaby, who shared things with me that I was never going to be able to get to, because those places were just not accessible to me. So while I think it is, I don't want to say it's a hindrance. I want to say that it makes it more difficult. But I also think that with us moving towards digitizing, that might reopen things in a way that they were never going to be as possible in terms of being able to access some of these things. At a certain point in time, if you wanted to look at a certain document, if it was held someplace in New York, you had to physically go there to see it. Not that we are keeping up with everything that needs to be digitized, but there's a lot more that is accessible because it has been digitized to people no matter where they are in the world. What I think is probably another thing, and I also don't want to call that a hindrance either. I think it's a difficulty, and I kind of talked about it a little bit in my paper, that Amy Ashwood Garvey was this prolific writer, but we don't have a lot of those works. Lionel Yard rescued the day before they were going to put everything in her home in a dump, boxes and boxes of her papers and manuscripts. But even today, his collection is no longer the collection that Toni Martin looked at versus the collection that Nydia Swaby looked at. So her work is continuing to be lost and to disappear. So I still want to say not a hindrance, difficult, but not impossible. And I think as we continue to examine her life as well as other Black women activists and intellectuals, I think we're going to uncover more things and also new ways of looking at those individuals as well. So I don't think a hindrance, but difficult, yes, yes. And I also just want to add that scholar whose name I couldn't remember, her name is Kanetta Hammond, and she wrote Black Britons and the Politics of Belonging. And she has written about Claudia Jones as well as Amy Ashwood Garvey in that work as well, to a lesser extent. And I don't know if I answered everything that you were asking, Professor Duncan.
You can.
Yes.
So can I say something?
Go ahead.
Yes. My name is Professor Rupert Lewis, and I'd like to commend our presenter, Disa, for a wonderful lecture on Amy Ashwood Garvey. And also to commend Anya Thompson, who I understand is the new director curator of Liberty Hall.
Thank you,
So
Professor.
I have a challenge just as you start. Where is the grave of Amy Ashwood at Calvary Cemetery?
We are
I
going
mean,
to
we talk
find it,
about
right?
lost papers, and that's certainly very sad, and efforts still have to be made in the different archives to track them down. But the Catholic Church, I know, made an effort through Deacon Peter Espute to try and identify where this was. And I think it is high time that in Jamaica we identify where she's buried and have a proper memorial to her. What Adisa has presented, it will be a crime on our part not to identify where she's buried and pay homage to her in an appropriate way. So this is a task we have for 2022, and it can be done.
Thank you, Professor Lewis. And I do take on that task and the challenge. And Adisa, you'll help?
Yes, I'm happy to help. I would love to see that happen. Yes. And I have to say thank you to, he should be in my thank yous, because Professor Lewis has like, yes, you can come to my home. I've totally written him like erratic emails. This is what I'm doing. Do you know about this? So thank you as well, Professor Lewis, for giving me time while I've been researching here.
Okay, so we're going to move on to our main guest speaker. Adisa, again, I want to say thank you. And we have to also give credit to Adisa for making this link with Dr. Nadia Swaby. So Dr. Nadia Swaby, I am going to read her biography and then tell you a little bit about her title. She is a Black feminist researcher, writer, and curator. Her practice engages archives, autoethnography, photography, the moving image, and the imagination to explore the gendered, diasporic, and affective dimensions of Black women's being and becoming. Nadia is an editor of Feminist Review and co-edited an issue on Archives, July 2020. She's a Caird Research Fellow, jointly based at the Center for the Study of Legacies of British Slavery and Royal Museums, Greenwich. She's also a curator of learning at the Institute of Contemporary Arts, London. Nadia is currently writing a monograph about Pan-African feminist Amy Ashwood Garvey that uses her archives, life, and activism to ask broader questions about the futurity of Black feminist archives and archival research. Lawrence Wishart, summer 2022. That's the footnote. She has a PhD in gender studies from SOAS, University of London. Now that's a mouthful and a half and a very impressive bio. And without further ado, I'd like to present Dr. Nadia Swaby. She will also be presenting, as you heard, some photography and some slides and so forth. So please engage.
Hello, Anya. Thank you very much for that introduction and for making your way through my biography. I want to also thank everyone that's here today to watch this call or watch this program that's honoring the 125th birthday of Amy Ashwood Garvey, celebrating her life and legacy. Thank you to Stephen Golding as well for the invitation. And thank you so much to Adisa Verabidi for making this connection and sharing information about my work, which gives me a really great opportunity at an exciting moment on an auspicious occasion to talk about Amy and to talk about the kind of work that I'm doing on her. And I also want to thank Professor Natanya Duncan, both for someone who I've met previously, and we've talked about Amy Ashwood Garvey, but also I want to thank you for the questions that you posed in response to Adisa's paper, because in fact, that's very much what I'm grappling with in my work. How do we tell the story about someone like Amy Ashwood Garvey, who lived in so many different places, who chose to move, who had multiple different homes, whose archive is what I like to think of as dispersed and fragmentary? And what does that present? What kind of opportunities does that present for me as a Black feminist researcher to think differently about Amy, but also to make a wider comment around Black feminist archives, Black women's archives, and Black feminist archival research? So I'm going to share a presentation which is comprised of my research on Amy in terms of archives and autoethnography, and read a little bit about the way that I've been trying to stitch together a story about Amy and the places it's taken me to, and where I hope it will take me in the future.
And I neglected to say the title. The title of your presentation is Amy Ashwood Garvey, Black Diaspora, Feminism, and the Archive.
Thank you. So just want to confirm that you can see the slides. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, great. So how can we tell stories about someone like Amy Ashwood Garvey when we have incomplete and inconsistent information? How can we tell stories about her life and stitch together a narrative that allows us to be with Amy, to experience her, to remember her, when her information is dispersed and fragmentary, as I said? I want to give you one example of what I mean about inconsistent or complex information about Amy's history, which we can get from the archive. In an autobiographical essay, Amy Ashwood Garvey writes, "I was born in the eastern tip of Jamaica, in the most ancient and popular town of Port Antonio, in the parish of Portland." Amy names her father, Michael Delbert Ashwood, and her mother, Marjoriana Ashwood, spelt with one N. Says her last name, or maiden name, was Thompson. And in that same piece, Amy cites her birth date as the year 1895 on the 18th day of January. This coincides with the birth record for one Amy Adina Ashwood, whose parents are named as Michael Ashwood, no Delbert, and Marjoriana Straffon, a different last name, Marjoriana spelled with two N's, that I found in Ancestry.com. But then when you look for a visa application that Amy submitted to the American Consular Service in the Port of Spain, Trinidad, in October 14, 1929, it lists her date of birth as January 10th, 1897. This was subsequently printed on an immigration identification card that Amy received in order to enter the United States and stay there during that time, her first trip. It also matches what was typed on an alien registration form that Amy mailed to the United States Department of Justice and Immigration Nationalization Service in March of 1944. Then when we go back in time, this was actually Amy's first trip, to 1910, and look at passenger ships that list her arrival to Ellis Island in New York, one for 1910 and one for 1918, it cites Amy's birth as 1893 and circa 1898, respectively. And then in 1946 interview with the Ashanti Pioneer, she offered a birth year of 1899. Then when asked her age in a New York Times reporter in 1968, Amy implied that her birth date and the year of her birth was nobody's business. So as you can see, Amy was clearly someone who had a complex narrative, a complex history, and even the archives we have around her actual date of birth can make it difficult for us to know exactly when she was born. But what we do know is that the approximation of 1897 and January 10th is most likely the most factual information, as this is what was present on her identification card. And I think whatever year Amy was born, whatever date she was born, she would absolutely be gathered here today to celebrate what would have been 125th birthday. So my research on Amy tries to use fragments of her archive as a starting point from which to imagine Black feminist archives as a critical site of speculation, experimentation, and collaboration. It tries to expand on existing knowledge about Amy Ashwood Garvey's life by attending to gaps in her archive through historical research, autoethnography, and arts-based research methods. So when I talk about Amy Ashwood Garvey's archive, I'm referring to an assemblage of documents, images, and narratives that can be used to create a speculative biography of her life. This archive is comprised of typed and handwritten letters between Amy and many of her business associates and friends. We find letters between her and Lionel Yard, letters she sent to William Tubman, letters that she sent to Claudia Jones. We find these letters of her. She was quite prolific in her communication with her friends, and her archive has many of these. Some of this material is held in collections in the Lionel Yard family papers. It's held in material that you find at the New York Public Library Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, particularly in the Claudia Jones collection. And there are many other places where you can find these letters of Amy Ashwood Garvey that she wrote with her friends. And also this archive about these photographs of Amy that's figured with herself and with other friends. Many, many photographs of Amy. She indeed seemed to be someone who loved to photograph specific moments. She loved to take photographs of other people that she loved. She took photographs of her travels. And you find many of these images in her various archival spaces. And I also think of her archive as being about the newspaper articles about her various activities. And indeed, she was often interviewed about her travels, where she was going to go, and there would regularly be advertisements about Amy's return to cities or return to specific places. And oftentimes you would see her interviewed around her organizing in different countries that she lived in. So newspapers become a really critical space in which we can come to know about Amy's travels, about her politics, and about the different places in which she called home. And of course, as Adisa mentioned in her presentation, we find manuscripts that Amy wrote and unfortunately never completed to publication. One of these is Liberia Land of Promise. This was a piece that she wrote very much reflecting on Liberia as a place where African descended people were migrating to, and what kind of opportunities were being created for them in this return to Africa, this important promise. And we also find another manuscript that Adisa mentioned, the one that's called Black Millions. And again, it's unclear whether or not that was her Garvey biography that she sort of modified and changed the title, but there are lots of documentation around Black Millions that she tried to get that published. And we also find another series that she tried to get published where it's just fragments of the writing in her archival material called the Africa series, which was very much about her own autoethnographic reflections of her experiences and travel in Africa. And her hope was to use the funds that she received from publishing this continuous series to support African women's organizations in Africa, supported in the diaspora, in the Caribbean and beyond. And so she saw her manuscripts and her publications as one way to make money for herself, but also to make money for her organizing efforts, while also continuing to advance her belief in the promise of Africa in a kind of Black diasporic subjectivity and in the organizing of Black women collectively. And then we also find some of her organizational records for the groups that she formed and campaigned for. One of the groups that Adisa mentioned previously being the International Friends of Asia. There are records around that. There are information around the Afro Women's Center and Resical Place in which you can look a site of information in which we can come to know Amy and her politics and the kind of activity she involved in. And there are also video recordings, one that's held at the Moving Image and Recorded Sound Division at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, where this video still is from. This image is from my research at the Schomburg Center. And it's an interview in which Amy is being asked to talk about her life with Marcus Garvey, but she also makes a point to comment on her life as a political activist in her own right. And this interview was featured as a part of a program that I believe was called Take That. It was premiered in the 1960s, and this was a popular African-American TV program that included political leaders. It featured music artists. James Baldwin was interviewed on it. So the fact that Amy Ashwood Garvey was in this is really an important thing to note as well. And this video can be found at the Schomburg Center. And of course, there are audio recordings of speeches that she gave at the University of West Indies, like the one that was played at the beginning of today by Anya. In addition to this, there are those two biographies that have been written about her life that Adisa mentioned in her previous her presentation. The first one that was written by her close friend and confidant Lionel Yard. And that one, as Adisa said, was very much thinking from a kind of emotion space and how her emotions and her belief and celebration of Blackness and her pride in her African heritage informed her political activism. And the second one is written by Marcus Garvey historian Tony Martin. And again, as Adisa said, that focused much more on her politics and her political organizing. And in many ways was quite critical of Amy Ashwood Garvey, and actually comes from a place of Amy Ashwood Garvey, while continued to advance Garveyism, was also critical of him as a result of the way that their relationship broke down. And so both of these men interviewed Amy Ashwood Garvey's family and friends, and they incorporated their reflections on her and who she was and what she had on their lives into both books. And so these are biographies, but they're really critical. And so for me, I also think of Amy Ashwood Garvey's archive as, let me go back, Amy Ashwood Garvey's archive as any space that she's ever visited, any place that bears her name, and any publication where her work is referenced. And so I try to engage this material using autoethnography, documented through photography and film, and then curated into sort of a series of still and moving images and collages in order to demonstrate the other kinds of knowledges about Amy that can be produced in the interaction between using archives for artistic, curatorial, and research purposes. Amy's life and activism is always the subject of my research, but it's important for me, for others to know her, perhaps in a way I have come to know her after more than a decade of experimenting with her archive and speculating about the knowledges it contains, and collaborating with other Black women to create activations and artistic installations where her work can be acknowledged and celebrated. And what I want to show is that the material it comprises might tell us everything we ever need to know in order to know Amy, in order to remember her, in order to honor her legacy. So that is to say that I do not see this gaps in her archive or this dispersed nature of her archive as a hindrance, but as an opportunity for us to kind of create our own archives about her, to build on existing knowledge through experimental, artistic, and creative ways, and using other methodologies that are not just the historical, but also the autoethnographic. So while Amy Ashwood Garvey is often referred to as the first wife of Marcus Garvey and the co-founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, knowledge about her life and her activism, independent of Garvey and Garveyism, have increased over the years. Indeed, many people tend to focus on her life after Garvey as significant because so much of her organizing and activities happened in that period. Indeed, the relationship that she had with Garvey was a relatively short period of time, given how long she lived. So much of the kinds of ways in which I think some of the scholars that I engage with around Garvey, around Marcus Garvey, Garvey, thinking about her life in New York. And that same year, the Nubian Jack Trust Community Trust, which is for us to come in and be in the archive of Amy Ashwood Garvey collectively. And there were a number of programs that happened alongside that, including an activation that myself and some others did around Black women's archiving practices, where we encouraged everyone to bring in collection of material that they felt reflected Amy Ashwood Garvey's life. And we created a live archive that then people who came to the exhibition were able to come to and see these extensions that we had shared. And recently, into 2021, Black women radicals celebrated Amy Ashwood Garvey's birthday with a post on Instagram that received a great deal of likes, and it fostered quite a lot of conversation in the comments about people who were familiar with Amy Ashwood Garvey, who'd never heard of her. And so social media has become a really interesting space in which histories about Amy have been shared increasingly, I've noticed in the last few years. But this Black Women Radicals post was a particularly exciting one for me, because it was something that I follow as well. And it was just, I got to see the comments and be in dialogue with people who saw that post as well. So all of this material and historical research sort of suggests that what we already know about Amy to be true, that she was a prominent Pan-Africanist, that she participated in the 1945 Pan-African Congress held in Manchester. And it was there that she called for a resolution attending to the specific needs of Black and African women. The Pan-African Congress was initially organized by W.E.B. Du Bois, and it was a series of conferences that sought to bring together anti-imperialist African decolonialists and organizers to come together and talk about the future for Black people living all around the world. It was a critical space for international discussions. It was a critical space for the advancement of different key issues that were happening and places that were at the time the colonies, and also pushing forward a hope for a kind of unified space where this conference could happen regularly and people from these different locations could come together and think about how building for the future. And it was at this Congress that Amy Ashwood Garvey potentially felt quite frustrated about the way in which the idea of the Black man was repeatedly articulated, as all of the work that they were doing around the Black man, as though that's synonymous for all Black people. And Garvey said it at her Western Africa. And then she does return to London. I'll share a little bit about what she does in London in a little bit, but just to say that during her sort of tours of West Africa and the Caribbean, she was often linking up the important issues that were happening for women there and also back in the UK. And she was trying to sort of stitch together a broader Black diasporic feminist space. And so, okay, so during her time in Ghana, which I'll come back to in a little bit, Amy Ashwood Garvey starting to wear kente, and it was a practice she continued for the rest of her life. And so in many photographs that you see in her later life, she is often wearing kente, including in this one, which is a photograph that was taken at an activity that happened in London in the 1950s. You can see here featured in this photograph is communist activist and journalist Claudia Jones, and with whom Amy Ashwood Garvey served on the editorial board of her newspaper, the West Indian Gazette and Afro-Asian News. She's also featured here with Paul Robeson and Islanda Robeson, who she was good friends with as well, and she often hosted them and entertained them when they would travel to London for one of Paul's performances. She's also featured with a local councilwoman and councilman and his husband, or councilman and his wife in Kensington, who helped her to gain funds for some of the activities that she did there. And for Amy, in many ways, London was her home. And you can see this in the way in which she the kinds of social spaces that she created that and how that was instrumental in the development of Black organizing in that country. One thing, for example, that Amy did was the popular restaurant in London's Soho neighborhood that Adisa mentioned that was called the Florence Mill Social Parlor. This was a restaurant that was frequented by people like C.L.R. James and Jomo Kenyatta. And at this restaurant, critical Pan-African organizations were formed there, but also really important for the dynamics that were happening in Black Britain at that time. It was a space for the formation of a shared Black identity. These were spaces where Amy would feature meals from the Caribbean and from Africa, where people could come together to eat food that reminded them of home. The restaurant was decorated in tropical and tropical theme, and she really tried to bring out a sense of warmth in it. And so she used the kind of aesthetic and the kind of experience of food as a way of bringing people together to engage in a social interaction that was also fundamentally a political interaction. And this also happened in the space that she ran, the boarding house that she ran, that was called the Afro People Center and Residential Club, eventually becoming, at first it was the Afro Women's Center and Residential Club, and it eventually became the Afro People Center, as Amy began to think that, yes, it can be a feminist space, but it should also be a space where men started calling her the mother of African students in Britain. It was also a place where key Black the shock and horror and the frustration they felt about this murder of Kelsey Cochran, about the conditions in which they were living. And so out of this space, a critical anti-racist organization was formed, and it was a space where people regularly met to talk about what kinds of demands they would make on the British government in order to protect them and in order to defend their rights. It was a space where people gathered in initial discussions around the first kind of celebration of Caribbeans in Britain that eventually became the Notting Hill Carnival. It was a space where a lot of these different types of discussions happened. And so what I'm trying to do with my work is expand on this knowledge by curating a history of Amy's life through the conditions of her archive and what we know for sure, and adding on that by creating a kind of speculative biography. My work is speculative in the sense that I'm trying to not just say what we know for sure to be from the archives, but what the archives can tell us about the conditions and the time in which Amy Ashwood Garvey lived. And also to think about the kinds of ways in which she herself was engaged in a process of creating her own archive through these forms of documentation, through photography, through the brief clips of writing that she did through her travels. The issue that Amy often faced in doing any of her travels, any of her business adventures, were finances. She always struggled with limited access to finances and resources. Her travels, business ventures, and community projects often relied on the financial support of her friends and benefactors, but these connections were while intimate and deep, they were tight, they were fragile in the sense that people couldn't always fund everything that she had to do. And so Amy did have to abandon her home in London for financial reasons. And she left behind there a trove of personal papers and photographs that were later recovered by Lionel Yard and used in his biography. And I had the pleasure of looking at this material several times between 2009 and 2011, which includes, among other things, letters between Amy and her close friends like Kwame Nkrumah, and a draft of Lionel Yard's biography. And the way I wound up actually encountering Lionel Yard's family and getting a chance to review that material is purely by a research coincidence. I'd been reading Tony Martin's book, where he references Lionel Yard's family and being able to access that material. And then I found a copy of Lionel Yard's book, I believe like on maybe, like I ordered it used through one of those like bookshops that's like a used bookshop that has a platform, and I was able to order the book. And in the reading of the book, I saw in the introduction that Lionel Yard says he wants to dedicate the book to his daughter, Patricia Mallard, and his grandson, Phil Mallard. So I decided to just put Phil Mallard's name into Facebook and see if he had a Facebook account. He did. And I was able to use that as an opportunity to then, we developed a sort of relationship, and I was able to use that opportunity to review that material that Lionel Yard family Yard family holds in Brooklyn, New York. And so I spent several hours, several days at that family home in Brooklyn, patiently scanning and saving digital copies of everything he collected and several pages of his typewritten manuscript, curating an archive of sorts on my laptop. And this is a part of my practice as well, as how can I continue to save this material so that I can share it with others and so that I can use it in my research, but also try to create some other kinds of activations where other people can experience this material as well. And in addition to the papers that are held by Lionel Yard's family, Amy has a name collection, as many of you would, I'm sure will know, at the National Library of Jamaica in Kingston. She also has a name collection of photographs at the John Hope Franklin Research Center at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, which is largely comprised of photographs Amy took or had taken of her during her time in West Africa, including this photograph here, which you can see, it's the sort of back of the card is written in her handwriting. And so these photographs are very important ways of allowing me to tell her story, of being able to reflect on the emotional and political dimensions of her time in West Africa. And Amy also has a name collection at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem, New York, where she lived and worked as a chief assistant for Marcus Garvey and the secretary of the UNIA when it formed its chapter there. And other material can be found at the Alma Jordan Library at the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine, Trinidad, where Amy lectured and did a tour on women as leaders of world thought. And of course, there's additional material at the Moreland Spingarn Research Library at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And during my research in Ghana, where I spent 3 months earlier this year, I found traces of Amy in many different places. And I found traces of Amy in actual archives, but also by using her photographs to visit places that she went to, using her ethnographic reflections on the time that she spent there to go to those places, and also using the stories she tells about the first time she heard about her African heritage, and in particular her Ashanti heritage from her grandmother, in order to try to use a kind of embodiment in my own experience of traveling to those places to add texture and depth to what we know about her time there. So when Amy tells a story that when she was 12, she learned of her African heritage through a teacher, and that she was very sort of distraught to hear about this idea that Africans had come to Jamaica as enslaved people. And she asked her father about this, like, what is this story? Where do our family come from? And he took her immediately to go meet her great grandmother, Bohema, who was able to tell her that to fill in these gaps of knowledge for Amy. And she told her that she was on one of the last slave ships that came from Ashanti to Jamaica, and that she had been kidnapped from a warring tribe, but that in the area that she was from, her family were chiefs, and they were princes, and they were people who had engaged in forms of war and had a rich and lively culture, that they wore kente. And so Amy says that at that time, her grandmother made her promise that someday when she became a woman, she would visit Ashanti, their homeland. And she said that ever since that day, that there was a deep desire to see this place. It became a moving impulse of her life. She said, I'd been living in Ashanti spiritually, but she was here now, happy and in dutiful fulfillment of that great promise. And this is from an interview that featured in the Ashanti Pioneer that was published in February 15th, 1947. And so what I wanted to do was to try to visit these places that Amy Ashwood Garvey had gone to and try to see if I could just experience her. But what I didn't expect to happen was that I would actually get an opportunity to meet some of the people that would remember stories about Amy Ashwood Garvey. As I'm sure many of you know, that the sort of oral history practices in a place like Ghana is very significant. And so a lot of stories are passed down from family to family and are passed down or preserved by people who might be an oral linguist. So that gave me one entry point into thinking about the possibility of connecting with people who might have heard family stories about her. I'll share more about that in a bit, but I was also particularly interested in understanding the way in which Amy wore kente and how she wore kente and what she was trying to convey with that. And so I went to a kente village that was right next door to an area called Juaben, which is where Amy traced her family heritage from. And this would have been the kente village where fabric that Amy would have collected was made. I went there, I showed photographs of Amy Ashwood Garvey, and I asked the Kente specialist to tell me the meaning behind them, to help me pick out vintage fabrics that had the same meaning, that would have been created around the time that Amy was there. And I tried to use some of the meaning behind this fabric as another aspect of Amy's archive, in order to say, what was she trying to communicate about herself around her politics? Why would she have worn a particular fabric with a particular meaning while entertaining guests at the Afro Women's Center in London? Why would she have worn a particular fabric while presenting at a JAG political party event in Jamaica? And so Kente for me is another part of her archive, and it's another way to tell her story.
Despite that, they've achieved them.
I'm gonna pause this while I give an entry point here. And also, as I said before, I wanted to go to the places that she visited with the hopes of being able to connect with an oral historian who might be able to pass a story down. So I went to the Traditional Council in Juaben, and I was just showing this photo to the registrars and some of the people there. And one of the guys said, actually, there was the linguist of the palace. He was the linguist here for about 50 years. He right around there. Let me get him and bring him here, and you can show him these photos. The registrar is translating a little bit of what I'm asking, what I'm interested in. And so then I pull out this photo that I've shown here of Amy Ashwood Garvey sitting next to the paramount chief of Juaben, and he points to the man in the middle, who is the chief, and says, "Me papa." It turned out that was his father, and he was able to tell me an entire story about remembering when Amy Ashwood Garvey came there, around the way in which his father tried to set up opportunities for her to connect with her ancestors. And I'll just play a very sort of clip from that interaction.
Despite that, they've achieved them, told the whole town that they have to meet her because she's a descendant of those people who were taken from here to Jamaica. So I think it's
So for me, that was a very powerful moment in which I felt connected to Amy's spirit and her legacy in a way that I then used that as a kind of framework of kind of going with my intuition and going to certain spaces that I knew that she had been to, and to try to just engage in conversations with anyone that would be around, and anyone who might be interested in telling me more about Amy and about what they know about the particular time in which she lived there. And so that sort of, it was a kind of happy coincidence that I also wound up being in Ghana at the same time as the 3rd annual Kwame Nkrumah Pan-African Intellectual and Cultural Festival, which is held at the Institute of African Studies, the University of Ghana. And this year's theme was on Pan-Africanism, feminism, and the next generation. And they curated an absolutely beautiful exhibition that was dedicated to Pan-African women. And when I walked into the space where the conference had been held, the conference was virtual, and they were encouraging people to come to the exhibition, in the month afterwards. And when I walked in, the first thing that I saw when I walked in there was this blown up photo of Amy Ashwood Garvey. And so it was for me a really powerful way of remembering that her history exists in all these sort of marginal spaces that are not always located at the center. It's not always in the archive, but the way in which people are trying to advance her story through other forms, through exhibition curation, through other forms of research, through other forms of experimentation. And at this conference, there was also papers given by people like Carol Boyce Davies and Rhoda Reddick, who made reference to Amy Ashwood Garvey as well. And crucially, I also really felt Amy Ashwood Garvey's presence when I went to the W.E.B. Du Bois Center for Pan-African Culture, particularly in a room that was the office of Shirley Graham Du Bois. On one entire wall of that room were photographs of Pan-African women. Amy Jacques Garvey was there, Islanda Robeson was there, Adele Casely Hayford was there, but there was not a photograph of Amy Ashwood Garvey. And so in order to bring her into that space, I worked on creating a series of images of me holding Amy, a photograph of Amy in there, but also propping up that photo of Amy in certain locations in the room as well. And I also thought that it would be important to bring Amy to a space where Marcus Garvey was honored. There's actually a Marcus Garvey guest house on this compound, the W.E.B. Du Bois Center. So I importantly took photos of myself in front of this signage as well. And I also tried to visit like popular tourist destinations that Amy went to during that time that she was in Western Africa, like Lake Osamtwe, and to try to just document myself in that space as a way of adding to her archive, as a way of visiting and following, in other words, following in the footsteps and experiencing the same types of things that she did on these adventures. And I must say that I felt Amy there with me. I felt her in the kinds of conversations that I was able to have with people about my research and what I was doing in the area. I felt her in the types of food I consumed there and thinking about what she might have eaten while she was in Ghana and so on. And so this is very much an important part of my methodology. It isn't so much about trying to do a traditional biographical account, but to use the dispersed and fragmentary nature of her archive and how I've accessed this material to ask broader questions about her life, to situate her within a kind of broader experience, but also to advance and to think about new ways we might tell research or to do research or tell stories about a woman like Amy Ashwood Garvey. And for me, this is a research practice, it is a curatorial practice, and it is also an artistic practice, which I feel like honors her legacy in the sense that Amy Ashwood Garvey was also an artist. She was a poet, she loved poetry, she was a playwright, and she hosted several different plays that toured around the United States. And so I'm trying to bring together these different aspects of her life in order to tell her story in another way, in a more complete way. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Nadia Swaby, for that presentation. Phenomenal. I'm sure we're going to have questions coming from everyone else, but my first question is, how do you said you channeled her. How do you, I mean, I can't say nay because I can understand if you're immersed in learning about someone, they could possibly visit you on that journey, right? So how did it feel? I mean, just give us a little bit more of that energy, if you could.
Yeah, for sure. I think the most powerful moment for me was being in Kumasi, because that's where she spent a lot of the time when she was in Western Africa, or particularly when she was in what was then the Gold Coast, what is modern Ghana. I think for me, channeling her involved like some elements of spiritual practices, of being in a meditative space, being in a kind of space of thinking about trusting a kind of embodied relationship to her archive, sometimes re-listening to audio clips of her speaking, looking at the photographs of her again and again, and looking at the photographs that she's taken and taking them out with me when I went to places. For me, it was just trying to think about how can I be with Amy and not just research Amy, but how can I actually be with her? And for that is to come to know her in a particular way, but to take her with me on this journey. And while I was there, I had this intention that every day I was going to write. I was going to write every day after every kind of interaction. But then I kept thinking about the fact that Amy tried to complete all these publications and she never finished many of them because she wasn't always just writing, she was doing. And I was like, oh, so then it's important for me to just be here and do, and to try to take notes and to write, but to just be here in the space, to try to channel the way in which she experienced this space without having to always write like complete chapters, but write just little ethnographic notes, little footnotes of what I might return to a bit later on. And I think that, you know, that really came to a kind of rising point when I went to Juba Traditional Council and I was showing that photograph, which was another critical part of my thing as well. I use photos and with this idea that Tina Camp puts forward around the social life of the photo. How can using photographs of someone and that be initiating a conversation about them be a way of adding to their archive, and how can that tell stories about someone as well? And so I think that was an important part of it too, is showing the photographs to people and letting that be a way in which me and that person I was showing a photo could be with Amy too.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer. Does anyone else have any questions for Dr. Swaby?
Hi. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Sister Swaby, it's nice to see you again, and congratulations on an excellent presentation. I'm appreciative of how you close the presentation and your open admission to feeling and sensing the presence of the subject. We are sometimes criticized for that kind of invocation of the subject as over identification, or in some way or another being confused or clouded for this presentation and in other spaces, have really allowed us to have an open dialogue kind of narrative about Amy Ashwood, and also allows people to bring their own mores, their own skill sets to understanding her. I wonder if you have any feeling on how that then helps shape the scholarship or the direction of the historiography or the sociology even associated with Amy Ashwood and her contemporaries.
Thank you. That's a really great question. And thank you as well for your warm words around my presentation today and my work on Amy Ashwood Garvey more broadly. I think for me, one of the things that I'm trying to advance, or one of the things I'm trying to suggest, is that for someone like Amy Ashwood Garvey, and indeed for many Black women who we would want to write stories around, for many Black women or Black feminist activists whose story we would want to tell, relying exclusively on the historical or the sociological, rather than also experimenting with the embodied and the artistic and the affective as a way of telling stories, I think really limits what we can know. And for me, I truly believe that a part of the knowing of Amy is also knowing how her story has transformed individuals' lives, even that being me as a researcher, what kinds of questions that has brought up for me. The journey that I've gone on with Amy is, for me, is just as fundamental to her archive as the physical or material information that one might contain. One thing that I often tell people, that I wound up doing a PhD in London because of Amy Ashwood Garvey. I had gone to do research on her as a master's student in London, as I mentioned previously. And it was while I was there that it was my first time going back to London since I'd been a child. And it was while I was there walking in the streets in Ladbroke Grove where she had been, trying to visit places where the Nigerian Progress Union, the student house where Nigerian student lived, might have been, trying to go to areas where the Florence Mills Social Parlor could have been, was what created an imagination of me also being able to be in a place like London, to live and to continue my research and my scholarship. And for me, that's a part of being with the subject, not just being about her history, but about what can I learn from her journey. It similarly, I think, has informed the relationship that I now have to Ghana as a person of the African diaspora, as a researcher, as a scholar. The fact of knowing that she lived there and spent time there, and that she found a kind of home in that place as a part of her reclaiming of her African subjectivity, is what makes it possible for me to feel comfortable in a space like that. And I think what I'm trying to suggest is that there's no disconnect between me as a researcher and the research that I'm doing and the subject that I'm looking at. And I think that's the thing that part of what I want to put forward, that I think for many of us, as you say, there's a pressure sometimes to do this type of work at a distance, to act as though there's a way in which I can tell a historical fact about someone and that I'm not changed by it, and that it's not informed by my worldview, by the things I believe in, the things that I want to see. My work on Amy Ashwood Garvey is to say that Amy Ashwood Garvey has informed my worldview, and my worldview is informing the way in which I talk about Amy Ashwood Garvey as well. Those things I see as deeply connected. And for me, I think that creates an opportunity for us to think about the role of Black feminist research and Black feminist archival practices in a wider way. So for me, I'm interested in how can we share our research material, and how can we make our research material a part of the archive? Is it in the role of digitizing? Is it by making our materials available to research libraries when we access them? Is it by telling those research libraries, if somebody else comes here and does work on Amy Ashwood Garvey, let them know that they can contact me? These are all things that I'm trying to suggest, or lessons that we can learn from Amy Ashwood Garvey's work, from the way in which she collaborated, from the limited resources that she had that also structure the types of research that I'm able to do. So in essence, I think it's about me thinking about a kind of way in which I can expand what we even mean when we say archival research or archival methods, specifically as it relates to the lives of Black women activists and Black women more broadly. Does that answer your question?
Oh, it does, beautifully and excellently well. Thank you so much for that, Sister Swaby.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Dr. Swaby. Does anyone else have any questions for you or for her? Well, I want to say thank you again for short notice too. You actually came not just prepared, but excellently so. I am impressed with both you and Adisa Beatty in regards to not just the level of preparation, but the information that you were able to share with us and educate us on just not the phenomenal woman, Amy Ashwood Garvey, but Marcus Garvey's legacy on the whole. On behalf of Liberty Hall, I want to thank you. Thank you for coming online, Adisa. I just want to say thank you to Adisa Vera Beatty, Fulbright Scholar from Howard University. She's here in Jamaica doing research, and we're hoping to facilitate quite a bit of that research. And I also want to thank our librarian, Natolia Sims, who's on the call and also helping Adisa in her efforts. Thank you, Dr. Swaby, for again turning around such a wonderful presentation and sharing with us not just your thoughts, your insights, and your journey. And I do wish you God's blessings on the better part of your, not dissertation, but your book. Is it a book? Your book. Right. So definitely God's blessings on that, because I do look forward to reading it for sure. The people that I did not expect to see, Dr. Duncan and Professor Lewis, thank you so much for joining us and being engaging our speakers. And of course, the UNIA is also here. Thank you, Mr. Golding, for helping to facilitate the program. I will actually leave everyone with the Ethiopian Universal Anthem. It's a song that they close out, I think, UNIA meetings to, as well as I do believe it's indicative of this whole presentation and wrapping up a beautiful, someone is actually joining us. Adisa, you're coming on again? Okay, so.
Sister Anya, do you have access to Amy Ashwood's recording of this song or any of the songs that she recorded?
Were you on in the beginning of the program?
Yeah, I heard that, but I understand that, and maybe Sister Swaby can elide on this, that there are actually another set of songs, and I didn't get to ask Adisa if it was something that she had come across as well, that there are about 9 in total, in addition to the 2 that have been widely circulated. Is there any substantive information on that, Sister Swaby or Sister Vera?
Yeah, I've not come across them myself. I know that they exist, and it's been one of the things I've looked for. So instead, I've tended to find like clips of Amy Ashwood Garvey's recordings and speaking, which is actually why, Anya, I was going to actually ask you, can I have a recording from what you shared earlier today? Because I think that's something that actually I'm sort of working on now, is to try to find more things that I've recorded in her voice and other things that she recorded from activity. So I haven't come across it, but I'm looking for it. So if you actually have done some search yourself and have some leads on it, or Adisa, if you know where some of that material might be held, I'd love to hear.
Right. That's new to me, what Professor Duncan just said about there being 9 recordings out there, or different songs. I only know about what she recorded with Lionel Yard in the basement of his home and it was like to commemorate Marcus Garvey. And I was told by Lionel Yard's daughter that it was a limited edition, and she doesn't even know where any are. She knows that her father had some copies, but she's never been able to find any herself.
Okay, we're gonna do a group email with John Bracy from
Okay.
UMass Amherst. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Sorry about that, Anya. Excuse
Oh
me.
no, please. This is good gathering of information. If you don't mind, you can include our librarian on that. I'm offering her up.
Of course.
Okay, great. And that's Natalia Sims. Okay, and that's Liberty Hall's librarian, by the way. So again, I just want to say thank you. And we do have the closing hymn of the UNIA mass meetings that occur usually every first Sunday. Is that correct, Mr. Golding?
Okay.
Okay, so you can you share that link in the comments before we close out? It's the first. No.
Yes, that there are additional recordings other than the 4 that have been publicly circulated. But we'll confer with Professor Bracy. Professor Bracy was friends with Mr. Yard, and so there's some things that he still has that came from Mr. Yard's Brooklyn home that include these recordings. I just haven't figured out how to bribe him to get them yet. So maybe the 3 of us showing up to ask might make a difference, or 4 of us asking might make a difference.
More ammunition, the better. Does anyone else have any comments or questions, queries? Okay, so again, thank you everyone for joining us. I do want to, I think I just lost Professor Lewis, but I do want to thank him again too for joining and having engaged our speakers. Liberty Hall signs off with the Universal Ethiopian Anthem. And I'm going to go ahead and play that now.
A storm cloud at night suddenly gathers, all armies come rushing to thee. We must in the fight be victorious, when swords are thrust outward to gleam. For us will the victory be glorious, when led by the red, black, and green. Advance, advance to victory, let Africa be free. Advance to meet the foe, advance to meet the foe, with the might of the red, the black, and the green, with the might of the red, the black, and the green. O Jehovah, thou God of the ages, grant unto our sons that freed the wisdom thou gave to thy sages, when Israel was sore in need. Thy voice to the dim past was spoken, Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hand. By thee shall all fetters be broken, and heaven bless our dear motherland. Advance, advance, to